Welcome back, American Studies students, to our last video lecture on progressivism. I know you can't wait for this moment, for this time period to end so we can move on. And I agree with you, but there are a few details and a few things we want to present to you before we do move on. And so we'll title this lecture The Last Chapter, Taft and Wilson. And so let's get started. So the last chapter of the Progressive Era, and again, just to remind all of you that the Progressive Era in many ways was an attempt to reform American society, its morals, its social structure and social life, its political life and institutions, how politics works, and the economic system that we know as free market capitalism. So these are all the goals and aims of the Progressive Era that we've been working on now for a little bit of time. So we're going to look at the Taft Presidency really briefly, not in any great detail or depth. Sorry, William Howard Taft. We are going to then look at the Wilson Presidency in a little bit more depth and detail because Wilson was president for 8 years and he achieved more than Taft. So, with that being said, the Taft Presidency. We ended the last lecture, if you remember, with President Theodore Roosevelt, a Republican who came into office in 1901, served out the remainder of William McKinley's first term, and in 1904 won election to the presidency in his own right. And Roosevelt was a new creature, a new animal, a new force in American politics, in particular the presidency. So when President Roosevelt left the office in 1909, claiming that he did not want to run for another term, he turned to a longtime friend, William Howard Taft, and encouraged him to run for the Republican nomination. Taft agreed, accepted. Taft was selected by the Republican Party to be the candidate in the 1908 election for the presidency, and Taft won handily, defeating William Jennings Bryan of the Cross of Gold speech. So, but there was great expectation with Taft following Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt thought that he would continue the work that he himself had started, that he would be an energetic and charismatic president. Yet it turns out that Taft was not charismatic, energetic, like Teddy Roosevelt. He was a little bit more cautious, a little bit more staid. He was very studious. In fact, he was a person who really loved the law. And so there was not the excitement that people had expected. So what did Taft do? Quickly, he did bust trusts, and that's something that Teddy Roosevelt started with the Northern Securities case. If you remember back in 1902, the Railroad Trust. Taft initiated under his 4-year term many more suits against the big corporations or trusts than Roosevelt. And one of the biggest successes the U.S. government had was breaking up John Rockefeller's Standard Oil Trust, and that occurred in 1912, and a huge victory. So yes, Taft does deserve our attention. However, Taft got hung up on a tariff bill, something that we don't talk much about. It's not that exciting. It's very detailed, technical, and quite boring, really. Tariffs deal with trade, and really a tariff is an import or a tax on imported goods to the United States. These taxes or tariffs generate money so that the U.S. government can function. And for a long time, as the American economy had grown and America had become more part of the world economy, there were calls for a much lower tariff. However, traditional politicians, both Democrat and Republican, wanted to have a higher tariff, that is, to keep foreign-made goods out of the United States and protect American-made goods. So we see this idea of protectionism of American companies and profits. Taft tried to reform the tariff and failed, which became sort of a big disaster. And you see that sort of cartoon over there with the elephant in the rear of the elephant pointing at those politicians. You can imagine or fill in the blanks for yourself. The other thing that Taft got caught up in was a controversy over nature. And I ended the last lecture with Roosevelt. He was one of the great conservationists, really giving attention to the environment and to some degree protecting the environment and natural resources. So parks, national parks, national forests, and wildlife. And Taft sort of did not have the same attention or concern for the environment. And in fact, under Taft, he removed over 1 million acres of forest land from the U.S. national forests. And this is really what kind of upset Roosevelt. At this point, Roosevelt had left the presidency. He had gone on this big African safari tour because he was a great big adventurer and outdoorsman. He'd come back to the United States sometime in 1910, and he was really dispirited, dismayed, and in a state of despair over how Taft had been running the presidency, or how he had been acting as president. So Roosevelt's going to decide that he wants to get back into politics and himself run again for president. And this is going to set up the next slide, which is the election of 1912. But it was really kind of a combination of tariff bill disaster and nature controversy that undid the Taft presidency, if you will. So we're going to move on to the 1912 election, a most divided affair. I think the political cartoon or poster down at the bottom really highlights that. You see an elephant divided by a moose equaling a donkey. Each of the political parties had major political parties, that is, had symbols. So what makes the election of 1912 interesting and unique is that there were multiple parties involved. In fact, there were 4 major parties involved, and that suggests a divided nation. For the Democrats, you had Woodrow Wilson, who had been the president of Princeton University, then the governor of New Jersey, and as governor of New Jersey, he was progressive. So he brings a great deal of progressive enthusiasm, this time from the Democratic side. The Republican William Taft, who was still president, is running again for re-election in 1912. And again, we discussed some of the problems that plagued his presidency. Now we have Theodore Roosevelt. So he comes back from the safari. He's upset and unhappy with Taft and the way things are going. He then forms his own political party called the Progressive Party, or the Bull Moose Party. And therefore, you see now the 3 major parties that I've listed. The Democrats are represented by the donkey, and that's Wilson, and he's going to win the election. You have the Republican Party represented by the elephant, and that's Taft, and the Progressive or Bull Moose Party are represented by Roosevelt. And what happened in the 1912 election is that the Republican vote was divided. There were many Republicans who liked Roosevelt, were loyal to Roosevelt, yet there were also many Republicans who, as good Republicans, said, I'm going to vote for the Republican candidate, and that's William Taft. He was the president. So there's this loyalty factor that comes into play, and the Republican Party simply split the public and the electorate, and that led to Woodrow Wilson winning the election. Woodrow Wilson, ironically and oddly, only scored 42% of the popular vote, so he's what we call a minority president. Now, how do you become president if you only win 42% of the vote, which is less than a majority? You win the Electoral College, and that's why I've included, sorry for the interruption, that's why you see the map of the presidential election of 1912. It shows the electoral results, and you can see that the red states, or whatever that color is, are Wilson states. Roosevelt was the green states, and then the Republican Taft, the blue states. And you can see that Roosevelt himself, as a progressive Bull Moose Party, won more states and more electoral votes than the sitting president, which is kind of an interesting thing. So we're going to now see a shift in power away from the Republican Party to the Democrats. This hadn't happened since the election of 1892. And I like the poster up at the top, just to point that out. It says triplicity. So you see donkey, moose, or elephant, a divided nation. The issues that were really involved in the election of 1912 are, interestingly, they're really the same for all the parties, and that really is the role of government in the economy and society in general. And last but not least, I didn't mention Eugene Debs. He was the Socialist Party leader, and he runs in the national election, so that's kind of an unusual thing that most people don't realize. The Socialist Party did exist. It was rather large, though obviously not a significant player in national politics. Eugene Debs did poll something just short of 1 million votes nationwide. So that's kind of interesting, and we really haven't talked much about socialism in the United States, but it was a lively party that helped, I think, to push some of the major parties to really take seriously the problems of the free market capitalist society that had produced great wealth, but for very few people, leaving the workers kind of out in the cold, out in the dark. So I think that the Socialist Party deserves some mention as they tried to push the major parties to address these serious economic issues. So as time is ticking down here, let's take a look at President Woodrow Wilson in the last couple of minutes of this lecture. Wilson came to office, again, having been governor of New Jersey, and he brings with him a program that he calls New Nationalism. And really what he says, and he made it very simple, he was going to attack three things: the triple wall of privilege. He was going to attack tariffs, trusts, and banks. And this is exactly what he does. So in many ways, Wilson goes back to Roosevelt. He's a very active, energetic president. He is very effective in laying out his vision for the people and the Congress, and he actually gets things done. So let's take a look at some of these achievements. The Clayton Antitrust Act, 1914, and you can see that over there in the political cartoon underneath Wilson with the big stick. Again, hearkening back to Roosevelt. The Antitrust Act was simply going to give the federal government more powers to prosecute, that is, go after the trusts in courts of law to break them up. And the idea was Wilson wanted to restore freedom to the American economy, and that is really based on competition. Trust limited freedom. They hurt competition. Wilson wants to attack the trust to restore freedom. Keep that in mind when we see Wilson as the wartime leader during World War I. Wilson also got Congress to enact and pass the Federal Trade Commission. And the Federal Trade Commission was going to investigate corporations to prevent unfair practices. So again, the corporations and trusts that are going to remain in existence are now going to be controlled or supervised or regulated by the government to make sure that they were following the rules. Again, to provide freedom and to provide some protection for American consumers and workers. And you can see the Federal Trade Commission building there in the lower right. It still exists. It's in Washington. So these things still are very much in existence today. And so I think that's worth knowing. Let's go on while we have time. President Woodrow Wilson's other achievements include the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. And this created the first national bank since 1833. There had been banks during the Civil War. We saw and listened or heard really the podcast about banks and how there were so many state banks and city banks and what a confusing mess it was with up to 8,000 different paper currencies at one point in the 1870s and 80s. And really there was a big financial collapse and panic of 1907. We didn't really mention, but I'll just mention that the financial panic and collapse of 1907 hurt businesses, it hurt workers, it hurt the entire U.S. economy. And again, one of the culprits was the lack of a stable, sound currency. So Wilson is going to promote the idea of a currency. Okay, so the Federal Reserve Act created the national banking system. The Board of Governors that you can see there pictured is in Washington, D.C. They oversee a system of 12 regional banks that are spread out throughout the country. And these regional Federal Reserve banks then have member banks. So those are the banks that you and I go to. So Sovereign Bank, TD Bank, Citizens Bank. So all of the banks that you and I use are members of a regional Federal Reserve Bank. In fact, our regional Federal Reserve Bank is located here in Philadelphia, that then is part of the National Federal Reserve System that is controlled in Washington. And this Federal Reserve Bank really controls the amount of money that is circulating in the American economy by setting or establishing interest rates. And that's an interesting thing. So the Federal Reserve controls what we call monetary policy. That is the actual money. And at one point in time, it was still based on gold, the gold standard. Today, it is no longer based on the gold standard. It's simply based on trust. So we trust the Federal Reserve governors and board members to understand the economic needs of the country and then to provide the proper amount of money so that we can conduct our business. One of the other things that Wilson did was he finally got the tariff situation under control. He lowered tariffs, which is a tax on imported goods. Now, if you lower tariffs, that means the federal government has less money. So in order to replace the money lost by lower tariffs, Wilson says we need an income tax. And that's exactly what he gets Congress to propose. It passes, and it becomes actually part of the Constitution. So the 16th Amendment to the Constitution creates our first permanent national income tax, and you can see the different rates: 0 to 4,000, no tax; 4,000 to 21%, and so on. So with that, I'll end this lecture. Thank you very much.